Alright, so in the last video we looked at that table and it really kind of started outlining how we took the 1 million deposits, $1 million worth of deposit that's coming out of the Fed, going back into the money supply, and how it generated a loan amount of $800,000, and then our new loans of $800,000. There was $200,000 that's required to be kept in reserves, and then that money that's loaned out from Bank A goes into Bank B. Bank B takes a certain amount and they loan it out. And then that loaned amount goes into Bank C, and it continues on that trend. And we said that by the time we get all the way to the bottom and that money is fully loaned out all the way to the bottom, we wind up seeing that $1 million generates $5 million in deposits at a required reserve ratio of 20%. So now we are going to dive in a little bit more and look at some of the equations on how we actually come up with that. And one of the first, and before we do that, we're going to reiterate those two assumptions that we talked about in the last one. First one is that banks minimize their holdings in excess reserves, basically meaning they are attempting to loan out all the money that they possibly can. The second aspect about it is all proceeds from the loans are deposited into the banking system. Nobody ever keeps any cash. So as long as nobody's holding any cash, banks are loaning out all the amount that they possibly can. We can use some of these equations. And the first one we're going to talk about is this money multiplier equation. So the money multiplier is basically 1.0 or 1 divided by that required reserve ratio, reserve ratio. So in this case, that reserve ratio is 20%. So the money multiplier would be 1 divided by 0.2, or is equal to 5. So we have a money multiplier of 5 in this case. Then we have the money supply equation. So the money supply equation, remember we said that there is a direct correlation between the amount of, or the money supply, and then the required reserve ratio, as well as the amount of excess reserves. So the money supply is equal to 1 divided by this required reserve ratio times the total reserves. So if we rewrite this, remember this little handy equation right here, 1 divided by the required reserve ratio, is the same thing as right there. So we can rewrite this formula as saying the money supply is equal to the money multiplier times the total reserves, where MS is that money supply, MM is that money multiplier, and TR is the total reserves in that particular economy. So now we're going to calculate the change in the money supply equation. So if we want to figure out the change in the money supply, how much is it going to increase or decrease by, we can figure that out by saying the money multiplier times, what is the money multiplier times the change in the total reserves. So if you remember, our change in our total reserves was that $1 million that was added in by the federal government, or by the Fed, by that Federal Reserve. Remember that the Fed, they bought $1 million worth of securities that put the money back into the hands of citizens who deposited in the bank, and the change in the total reserves was $1 million. Remember, our money multiplier was 5. And we figured that out way up here. So the change in the money supply, therefore, is 5 times $1 million. So we have a $5 million change in the money supply. Well, that's what we talked about on the past several videos, that we had $1 million put in by the Federal Reserve, and it winds up generating $5 million in total deposits. And that total deposits would be part of that M1 money supply. That checkable deposits become that part of that M1 money supply. So $5 million in new deposits is the change in that money supply. I'm going to reiterate this, $5 million in new deposits will generate $1 million in new reserves and $4 million in new loans at a 20% required reserve. So that should shed some light on how this required reserve ratio, changing in the required reserve ratio, will also impact the money supply. So if we change that required reserve ratio, and now that required reserve ratio is not 0.2, it's actually 0.1. So 1 divided by 0.1 would not be 5, it would actually be 10. So what if that required reserve ratio was actually 0.1 and the Federal Reserve changed the required reserve ratio to 0.1? Now we have a money multiplier of 10. We plug in that money multiplier of 10 down here. And then also right here, we would wind up coming up with a $10 million change. So how does changing the required reserve ratio impact the money supply? Well, it's very simple. The lower the required reserve ratio, the higher the impact of new deposits will make on the economy. The higher the required reserve ratio, the less of impact new deposits will make upon the economy. So changing that required reserve ratio will definitely affect that money supply. So we made these two assumptions over here, but do those assumptions always hold true? Well, under normal economic conditions, that money multiplier will actually range from 2 to 3. Whereas before we said that money multiplier was at 5, and we said that that required reserve is 20%. In reality, we usually deal with required reserve ratios of about that much, but by the time it all plays out, these two assumptions are not held, and the true money multiplier actually ranges from 2 to 3. The reasons that the money multiplier actually falls below this reciprocal of the RR are that the true money multiplier is actually less than what it should be is because of different aspects. One of them is known as this currency drains or currency leakages. And it's the desire of individuals to hold currency instead of depositing it. So basically, instead of taking the money that they receive from somebody else and putting it right back into the bank, they decide to keep some of it in cash. You know, they take it, they put it in an old glass jar and they bury it out in the backyard for safekeeping because they don't want to put it in the bank for whatever reason, or they put it in the cookie jar to save it for a rainy day type deal. The greater the occurrence, the more that people hold on to that currency, the smaller the multiplier. Also, there's the second aspect that breaks that assumption, is that banks desire to hold excess reserves. So they don't want to go down and loan out all of the amount that they possibly can just to kind of offset the risk of not meeting their required reserves or not having enough money on hand in case of withdrawals or anything like that. So because the banks desire to hold on to their excess reserves, the greater that the banks do that, the greater these instances, the smaller the multiplier. So even though that the money multiplier equation states that it should be around, sometimes in the case of 5, we see that it's a lot less simply because these two assumptions are not always held.